For this week's post, I want to reflect upon a classroom success and a failure to reflect on what worked and what didn't work and why they did. I'll start with the success. A week ago, I started my unit on the Middle Ages and decided that it made sense to start by taking a close look at feudalism. Since it was the dominant economic and social system that Middle Age society was organized by, I thought this was the best place to start. Instead of going with slot notes, I decided to take the time to make my own pyramid-shaped frame so students could visualize power and authority during the Middle Ages. First, I had students guess where kings, nobles, knights, and peasants fell on the pyramid, and then briefly talked about each group and wrote down a couple notes about each group on the pyramid while I was doing it on the document camera. Then I mentioned that the arrows that pointed to each different group on the pyramid represented the feudal burden, and I wrote down and discussed what these were. After this, which only took maybe 5, 7, 10 minutes, I transitioned into a simulation. It was the feudal candy simulation, where each student received 10 M&Ms in a cup. But students also received roles based upon the feudal pyramid. There were students that were peasants, students that were vassals/knights, two students that were nobles, then one student who was the king or queen. Due to the feudal burden or feudal contract, however, each peasant had to give 6 of their 10 M&Ms to knights in return for their protection. In turn, knights gave 5 of each 6 M&Ms they collected from their peasants to their lord or lord/noble in return for their protection and land. Finally, my 2 nobles gave 4 of each 6 M&Ms they collected from their knights to the king or queen. By the end of the simulation, peasants only had 4 M&Ms, knights had a total of 6 to 7, nobles had a total of around 15, 16, 18, and the king or queen had a total of around, I think it was 30, 35 M&Ms. So those M&Ms represented the power, the money, the resources that went to the top, and then also were kept at the very few that was kept at the bottom. After the simulation, I gave students a sheet that had reflection questions for them to answer about the simulation and about feudalism in general. From their written responses, I could tell that my objectives had been met, that students left with a strong understanding of feudalism and what it looked like. In addition to that, from their positive responses to the lesson during and after class, I knew that they were engaged. In fact, I had multiple students tell me, "Mr. Newcomb, we should do activities like that again." Now I'll focus on the failure. This past Thursday, we transitioned from taking a close look at feudalism and manorialism to spend a day looking at the Frankish kingdom and Charlemagne. The lesson I planned involved a short 15-minute mini lecture with slot notes, followed by a activity in which they would be paired together, in which each pair would read a sheet about the accomplishments of Charlemagne, and then organize that list into a mock resume for Charlemagne. Sometime within the first 7 minutes of the lecture, the students started to become restless, disengaged, and disruptive. By the time I got to the activity, nearly all students were clearly bored. Then during the activity, only half the students seemed to understand what I was asking them to do, even though I gave directions on the paper, on the board, and said them aloud. Additionally, I modeled an example for students and gave them categories in the resume in which to organize the list of resources. So, looking at the two and comparing them, what do I think worked about the first? Well, first of all, I think the thing that worked the most was when students were allowed to be interactive. This means that they were allowed to move around the classroom, to interact with their classmates, and feel like history was something that is active rather than passive. In the feudal candy simulation, this lesson required students to do all three of those. A second reason I think the feudal candy simulation worked is that it made history real and more experiential. Instead of just talking about history, listening to lecture, or writing down slot notes, I think the simulation helped students see how this particular historical topic worked. What do I think didn't work about the second lesson? Well, to start off with, last semester, the classes that I had, there were some where lecture actually did work. Obviously, this is not the entire class period, but they were much more receptive to lecture. This semester, it's a different group of students, and these students aren't that receptive to that. For me, now using lecture is something that I've been used to in undergrad and grad school, and it's often hard to think of ways to get away from lecture. I think there's this idea that we want them to lecture. We want to lecture because we want to make sure they have the information, and that just seems the easiest to us. But often that doesn't work. So when I look at my Charlemagne lesson, I know that I lost the students during the lecture portion. And once lost, I couldn't get them back, particularly when they were working on their activity. While half the students were able to complete the activity, the other half of the students could not re-engage in the activity after they had tuned out the lecture. So how can I learn from this? I'll use today as an example. Currently, as I'm writing this blog, I'm completely overhauling my lesson on the power and the structure of the medieval church. Before Thursday, I had planned on doing a typical mini lecture followed by summative, formative activity. After Thursday, I thought that I should change course. Fortunately, due to the wonders of the internet, there are teachers who have shared lessons that have worked for them, and I found one that combines students being responsible for learning, uses interactivity, and also uses movement. The lesson is called The Medieval Church Tea Party. So here's how it works. In the lesson, there are 14 possible roles for students to assume. Each role has a page to half a page of reading for each role. So at the beginning of class, when my students come in, each one of them will receive a different role. Before this, I'm going to go through the roles and read them. And so students that struggle with reading, they will probably get the half-page readings rather than the entire page readings. Anyway, when they come in, they will receive a role. And I will ask them to spend 5 minutes reading the role sheet that they have been given. I want them to focus on information about who they are, what they do, and why they are important. After those 5 minutes, students will take a question sheet. There's a post-question sheet, but there's a question sheet. And students will go around the room and talk to other students to ask questions. So, for example, one of the first questions asks students to go find a person who is a weak king and ask that weak king about his power, his relationship to the church, and things like that. Students will go around the room, and by the end, they are to have interviewed 2 popes, 2 kings, a bishop, a priest, a monk, a nun, and a heretic. A side note, the heretic role is maybe like 2, 3, 4 sentences long. So I plan on modeling an example, and I will assume the role of the heretic because I don't want to give any student a really small reading and everyone else has to do a whole bunch of reading. But my hope is that this lesson will be engaging and active for students. So instead of hearing me talk about the medieval church and how it worked and what people did in it, hopefully by having students assume those historic roles, read the information and summarize it, and then go around looking for other people who have different roles and asking questions, the hope is that they will gain more from this and learn more about the medieval church than me just talking to them. So this will make them responsible for their own learning. and they will do so by assuming those historical roles and retelling that information to their peers when they interact with them.